Period of slowest growth in a decade. Real GDP growth slowed to just 4.5% year-on-year in the latest quarter. And so this year's budget was a particularly challenging one for the finance minister. He was having to grapple with both the need to rein in the fiscal deficit, which is still running at closer to 5.8% of GDP. He needed to rein that in to 5.3% by the end of this month, and rein it in further, he said, to 4.8% by next year, by the end of March 2014. So that was his first key challenge. But the second key challenge was to also ensure at the same time that he did enough to improve the investment climate to ensure that the economic momentum could be turned around. And all this at a time when this government is really on its last legs. It has about 14 months to go in its current term in office. And typically the last budget of a government is the most populist budget, in India especially. So given that these were the challenges, how has he dealt with them? Well, he has come up with a fiscal deficit target of 5.3% of GDP for the current fiscal year, which now has just about 3 weeks to go, and 4.8% for next year. I think to some degree he has succeeded at least in meeting the basic goal of credibly raising sufficient revenue and cutting back on expenditure to get close to these targets. I think it's very unlikely we'll get to 4.8% of GDP next year. Let me just show you a few reasons why it'll be a bit challenging. If you look at this slide here, the chart on the right is the fiscal deficit on a 12-month rolling sum basis. So for each month, the government actually reports the fiscal numbers, if you look at this on a 12-month moving average basis, you can look at what the actual fiscal deficit is doing currently. It is currently at about 5.8% of the GDP, just short of 6. On a 12-month moving average basis, the fiscal deficit is running at 5.8% of GDP as of January. So there are just 2 months to go in the fiscal year. In the budget, most of the provisions in the budget really will have an impact in the next fiscal year. There is perhaps a little bit of room to do a lot of disinvestments in the last 3 weeks of the year. But it does seem that the 5.8% of GDP target, 5.3% of GDP target is rather difficult to achieve. Except for the fact that the final month of the fiscal year, March, is the biggest month for revenues. And so if all goes well, including things like the increases in gold import duties and so on, then we probably get to about maybe 5.4, 5.5, slightly closer to that 5.3, but I think 5.3 will be quite difficult to achieve. So at the same time, India now faces a twin deficit. Of course, the fiscal deficit is large, but the trade deficit has also been widening quite sharply and has hit new record levels. This is a 12-month moving average of the trade deficit. This year, the current account deficit for India should be about 4.5% of GDP. That is a record for any fiscal year. So the economic backdrop is not at all propitious. But what has he done to deal with this? I think the key aspect is he has raised import duties on gold and silver to try and ensure that some of India's enormous appetite for the precious metals results in a benefit to the government as well, and you get a little bit of a reduction in those imports. But clearly this remains a very significant challenge. The other challenge that he faces, of course, was the growth challenge. And let me just point out what the growth challenge is. This is the real GDP number for India. It's been decelerating rather sharply. Now, 4.5% GDP growth, the latest quarter, is really dismal for a poor developing country. India should be growing 9 to 10%. And the reason why it should be growing 9 to 10% is best illustrated by pointing to this.